Okay, before we get into looking at the discriminant, we need to be sure that we understand how to classify numbers as either rational, irrational, or non-real. Rational numbers are numbers that can be written as fractions. Irrational numbers are numbers that cannot be written as fractions. And one thing I want to point out here is that it's not necessarily that the numbers are fractions, but they can be written as fractions. For example, I have a -3, that's not a fraction, but it can be written as a fraction if I write it as -3/1. Irrational numbers are numbers that cannot be written as fractions. For example, pi or the square root of 20 or a decimal that's non-repeating and it goes on forever. And notice that an irrational number is not necessarily a number that can't be simplified. I can simplify square root of 20, but when I simplify that, I'm going to end up with 2 times the square root of 5. I still have that square root in there, so it is irrational. And one thing I want to point out about square roots, that just because you have a number that has a square root in it doesn't mean that it's irrational. If we look back up here with the square root of 36, well, the square root of 36 is 6. And 6 is a rational number. Okay? If you have a number that has a square root with a negative under the square root, that is going to be an imaginary number or a non-real number. And another thing I want to point out is that there are other types of non-real numbers and there are other types of irrational numbers other than what I have listed here, but these are the only ones that we're going to be discussing in this class. It sometimes helps to think of your classification as a Venn diagram. You have the real numbers in this set over here on the left of your screen and non-real numbers to the right. There's no overlap. Either a number is real or it's non-real. And it looks like in my picture that they're about the same amount of each, but there's not. There's a whole lot more non-real than there are real. And same thing with rational and irrational. There's a whole lot more irrational than there are rational numbers. But rational numbers and irrational numbers are both types of real numbers. We're going to see here in our next Venn diagram an example of how we can go about figuring out how to classify these numbers. Non-real numbers are going to have a square root with a negative under the square root. And an irrational number is going to have a square root of a positive number once the number is simplified. Right, so it helps to simplify these real numbers to help categorize them. So that's what we're going to be looking at on our next slide here is looking at some examples of numbers and classifying them. All right, first thing you should notice with problem number 1 is that you have a negative under the square root. So I know that this is going to be non-real. And I only have one number here, so that's one non-real number. Okay, problem 2, I still have a negative under that square root. Even though this +2 over here is added, this is still a non-real, or we call it a complex number. One non-real number. In problem 3, it's very similar to problem 2, but I have this plus or minus here, which tells me I actually have 2 numbers. I have 2 plus the square root and then 2 minus the square root. So here I have 2 non-real numbers. Problem number 4, I can simplify the square root of 20, but I know that when I simplify this, I'm still going to have a square root, so I have an irrational number. I have one irrational number. Problem number 5, I have square root of 25. I can simplify that. Square root of 25 is 5, so I have one rational number. Problem 6, you should be able to look at this square root of 50 and know that it's not a perfect square. I can simplify this, but I'm still going to have a square root in here. So I'm going to have irrational answer. And because I have this plus and minus in front of that, I actually have two irrational answers. Problem number 7, I have a square root of 49, so that I can simplify this to 4 plus or minus 7 over 8. Now this is going to be for plus 7 over 8 for one of my answers, and for minus 7 over 8 for one of my answers. I don't really care what they are. I can see that I just have integers here. I don't have any square roots. So I have rational answers, and I've got 2 of them. So I have 2 rational answers. In problem 8, I have the square root of 0 is 0. So if I looked at this as 4 plus 0 over 6 and 4 minus 0 over 6, I still have the same answer either way. Both of these simplify to 2/3, so I have one rational answer. Problem 9, I have a negative under that square root. So I have imaginary answers or non-real, and I've got a plus and a minus. So I have 2 non-real answers. Problem 10, I have this square root of 36 that I can simplify to 6. And you can see that my square roots go away, so I just have rational answers, and I have 2 of them. 2 rational answers here.